I chose to research the Philippines Rural Electrification Program because I've lived in the Philippines for an extended period in the past, and I've seen firsthand the levels of inequality that can exist within one country. Specifically, the differences in the rural areas and the population centers. One of the things that stood out to me was the inconsistency in access to electricity from the provinces and the capital. And the level of access between the population centers in the provinces and the rural outlying areas was also striking. This seemed to be a reluctantly accepted part of life there, and for this reason, it always interested me and felt it was worthy of a closer look. Prior to the establishment of the National Electrification Administration in 1960, only 19% of the country had electricity, and only about 14% of homes were powered. In rural areas, only 6% of homes were electrified, and according to a 1969 U.S. AID report, 90% of the Philippines was without power. This lack of power hampered the Philippines' agricultural and industrial development. Until 1969, the NEA oversaw and facilitated private utility corporations in supplying electricity to the country. However, due to the profit-driven nature of private utilities, which saw expanding into the rural areas as financially unviable, electricity was primarily confined to the cities. This problem led to the restructuring of the NEA and prompted the U.S. AID, who was already operating in the Philippines, to recommend that the country transition from the ineffective private utilities program to the cooperative program that had successfully brought electricity to the rural areas in the United States. Before the program could get underway, feasibility studies were conducted by USAID, which led to the approval of a $3.5 million loan and the founding of two pilot co-ops, one in northern Mindanao and the other in Negros Occidental in the Visayas region, with further expansion of the program being dependent on the success of these two pilot programs. However, even before the success of the pilots was determined, the Philippine government decided to go all in on the program, which was essentially a leap of faith because at the time, no other programs like it existed anywhere outside the United States. USAID then brought in the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, who set up establishing the framework, getting the NEA ready with a regulatory system and charters for the co-ops. With the framework in place, it was left up to the NEA to conduct the overall planning and implementation of the program and finance it by making long-term low-interest loans to the cooperatives it establishes. Each of the Philippine collectives are partnered with a U.S.-based sister co-op that helps with donated materials and professional volunteers, with the bulk of the materials being pole-mounted transformers. The donated transformers are the backbone of the cooperative's expansion, and the co-op's success depends on them. The donated transformers are then sent to a centralized NEA facility where they are refurbished and sold at a low cost to the rural cooperatives, with the proceeds going to help build distribution systems and income-producing ventures for the rural villages. While the U.S.-based sister co-ops provide material and expert advisement, the work and most of the coordination projects are done by the NEA, with the plan being that the NEA will train and appoint local leadership and management within the local villages, the rural villages. But as of now, the Philippine co-ops are primarily dependent on the sister co-ops in the United States. As of 2021, the number of collectives has grown to 119 co-ops, and about 97.49% of the population of the Philippines has access to electricity, even though there are still 1,700 sitos, small rural villages, that have no access to electricity. This is a significant increase from where the program was when it started in 1969, even with a decade or more of setbacks throughout the 80s. Overall goals were accomplishment. A U.S. AID report from 1980 highlights mixed effects of the rural regions due to electrification. The cooperatives were expected to boost rural power distribution levels of equality throughout the rural communities. This was not the case due to the limited number of involvement at managerial levels of the rural people. The study found that the directors were usually government employees, merchants, lawyers, or accountants, leaving general members of the co-ops with a limited say in proceedings and the direction of the co-ops. The initiative had financial difficulties throughout the 1980s due to the shortage of funding induced by the 1980s financial crisis, which resulted in failed investments and poor maintenance by rural electrification centers. By 1989, just 22 of the 120 co-ops were financially sustainable, and residential power availability was only at 50% of the Philippine population. In regards to lighting, in the Philippines, the cost of electric lighting was significantly cheaper than non-electric lighting, like kerosene, lamps, and candles. So that was an overall benefit. In and of itself, the electrification effort did not significantly improve the lives of the rural poor. In many cases, people experiencing poverty could not make use of the new access to electricity due to the individual homeowners being unable to wire their homes. Nor can the new electrification efforts be strongly linked to the creation of new employment opportunities or business ventures, mostly due to the overall unreliability of the power sources, at least in the early stages of the electrification process. Granted, the existence of the electrification made it possible for the creation of industries and employment opportunities down the road, but those were on the backs of other development efforts. But electrification in and of itself was not linked to any dramatic increase in quality of life. With the stated goal of the electrification program being to provide electrical access to the entire country, it has been successful, however slowly. As previously stated, electrification alone has not been the catalyst for any significant increase in social or economic development levels. However, on the back of other development efforts like road building and economic development, it has made other advances possible, like making refrigeration and manufacturing a possibility. It has led to development of employment opportunities and enterprises where previously there had not been any, and wouldn't have been had electric access not been available. Overall, based on the initially stated goals of electrifying the entire country, the program has made dramatic progress based on the percentages of access to electricity at the start of the program and now. However, outcomes like job creation and businesses that the NEA stated in early literature being the result of the electrification did not stem from the electrification alone, but as the result of a combination of other development efforts that occurred over time. One of the issues that I saw when researching the program was the USAID evaluation found that there was an often apathetic view towards the electrification program by many of the members of the rural communities due to feeling left outside the decision-making process and seeing directorships and managerial roles filled by individuals from outside their communities. Another is the level of dependency on the U.S.-based sister co-ops by the Filipino co-ops on donations and funding from the United States, evidenced by the stagnancy in the 1980s when funding was all but cut off. Also, the total dependence on materials like the pole-mounted transformers that are donated. Had that pipeline been cut off, the program likely would have halted. Overall, the things I would have done differently or changed would be a more thorough initial evaluation and ensured that the program created agency within the rural communities. It makes sense that any development effort should attempt to create agency, technical understanding, and self-reliance so that the local populace can sustain and maintain the development efforts. This could have been done by the NRECA or the USAID by ensuring training conducted by the NEA of the local populace to ensure that most, if not all, of the duties would be effectively handed down to rural community leadership. When the USAID conducted its initial evaluation in the 1960s, it would have been a benefit to understand the levels of the rural population's ability to actually make use of the electrification, because that was an issue. A lot of the communities were just unable to make use of the newly electrified villages due to not having wired homes, not being able to afford the electricity or the wiring. As far as parallels go between the program and the concepts we've gone over thus far, the program was created from a top-down perspective, in that it is modeled after a program that successfully electrified the rural U.S. and appears to discount the political and social realities on the ground. However, the literature points to the program being presented as an option instead of being forced upon the Philippines government. And at the time of its inception, there were a few other examples in existence at the time. So the U.S. model was used more out of practical use than possibly as a Western-centric model. Hegemony is also an aspect of the creation of this development effort in that it may have played a role in the Philippines government's hasty choice to choose the cooperative option as opposed to considering other options that may have been more beneficial at the time. With any development discourse, it always comes from a place of a power imbalance. And it's likely that the Philippines government felt pressure to accept the suggested model as opposed to researching a more effective model that would lead to a more reliable system in the current. There's also an argument for instances of anti-politics coming from the Philippine side of the House due to discounting the political and social realities in the rural communities. This is evidenced by the early claims by the NEA that the electrification of rural regions would lead to the creation of new enterprises and job opportunities on its own, and when the reality was that many of the rural communities were not able to take advantage of the new electrification of their towns. Thanks for listening.